Today we're going to focus primarily on the nuts and bolts behind what a zero-based budget is. We're going to do a deep dive into the things that I get questions with when I've helped teach what a zero-based budget is and how it works. I'm also going to share some of the lessons that I have applied to my own personal budget as we go through this. If you've listened to the podcast before, you've heard me briefly summarize that a zero-based budget is when you take your income, you put it up top. Below that, you add your saving, spending, and giving. This is the money that's going out from your checking account. You take your income minus that sum, and it equals zero. Effectively, mathematically, you're assigning every dollar of your income a mission, be it saving, spending, or giving. And that's it. That's a zero-based budget. You can have a budget that is simply that simple with just 3 categories, saving, spending, and giving. But if you're not more specific than that, it might be challenging to actually hit your goals. So the right budget for you is going to be one that's not overly complicated, but it's specific enough that you can be tracking your progress on your budget throughout the month and know that you're not overextending yourself on something. My personal budget has about 90 individual line items on it, and I consider my budget to be slightly more complicated than the average budget, and that's just because I'm like a bit of a nerd on it. So the right number of categories for you could be as low as 15 or 30. It could also be as high as 200. A budget is a reflection of your priorities. A budget is basically you taking the reins, taking control, telling your money what to do instead of the lack of money telling you what you cannot do. A budget embodies genuine freedom. By exercising discipline and giving yourself boundaries with money, by making decisions on paper on purpose, by having a plan, you're effectively freeing yourself up to pursue your priorities that you put on that plan. So what happens if you end up like me and you have so many line items in your budget as you're breaking down what matters to you and it's starting to look very complicated? In that case, you can take all of those line items and sort them into larger, more global categories. And by breaking them into more bite-sized pieces like that, you make your budget more easy to organize and more easy to digest. Next, I'm going to basically share with you what categories I use in my zero-based budget. The first main category that I use is giving. I typically put giving as the top item, the top category in my budget. And that's because I believe that it's important for me, that it's my calling, to not give what I have left over after spending. If I give myself that method, I'm probably just going to expand my own spending and outspend what I could otherwise then give. If I make giving a priority ahead of time, I can adjust my spending and modify it so that my giving can match the priorities for what matters to me, or what I feel religiously called to do with my giving. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't recommend that you give money away when you are struggling to cover your 4 walls. The 4 walls being transportation, housing, utilities, and food. But if you have discretionary income that can be spent on once, saved, or given away, it can be very valuable to take what you want to do with giving and put that as your top priority. After giving, I list all of my essentials. The next main category are my essentials. This is where the 4 walls live, and this is also where insurance lives for me. If you're working to get out of your non-mortgage debt, debt will be your next main category. On episode 12, I covered the debt snowball in more depth. That's basically where you would store your debt snowball. You would list all of your debts, smallest balance to largest balance, and work through your debt snowball here after you've covered your essentials. If you're working on getting out of debt and you're looking for some more information or motivation, I highly recommend that you listen to episodes 9, 10, and 12. Episode 13 can be pretty insightful as well. The next category that I have in my personal budget is lifestyle. Lifestyle is where I include the day-to-day expenses that aren't essentials, but are a part of my life. This is where I have traveling to see family, eating out, entertainment, and recreation. After lifestyle, I have the emergency fund. Now, the emergency fund is a single line item all to itself in my budget, but it's so important and I want to emphasize that importance, so I make it a category as well. It also helps me keep my accounts sort of organized. Every time I have a separate savings account or investment account, I make it its own category in my budget. And I break down the contents of those accounts into different goals, different sinking funds, if you will. And the sum of those should equal what is in that account. Makes it pretty easy to reconcile those savings accounts or investment accounts come the end of each month. After the emergency fund, I have my general savings account, or savings for short. This category includes anything I'm saving for that I expect to buy in the next 5 years or so, or any money that I need to have liquid possibly in the next 5 years. For example, a healthcare deductible would probably live here. And it's here where you can start investigating if your savings rate is enough for you. When you have your different budgeting categories, you're typically going to have a column or a section where you write down what it is that you expect to spend, save, or give for each individual line item. Next to that, you're going to have another column or another section where you can record, or it's automatically recorded, what it is that you've spent already. After that, given I put my budget in a spreadsheet, really like a column that shows me the difference between those two so I know how much is left in my budget and I can check it throughout the month and see what my progress is, or if I've overspent on a category. But when it comes to the savings account, you can add a couple more sections or columns. You can add what it is that you have saved for each individual sinking fund. You can also add what it is that you want to have saved. So your goal, your savings goal. This is basically the framework you need to make your goals a reality. If you feel so inclined, it can be very helpful to put a date on which you want to have that sinking fund or that savings goal completely saved up for. And in that way, you can then calculate how much you should be saving each month, how much you should be setting aside for that particular sinking fund every time your paycheck comes through in order to stay on track to meet your goal by your due date. After the savings accounts, I break up the next categories per my investment accounts. This is going to include retirement. I have a category for all my retirement stuff. I also have a category for my son. We have a ESA that we're using to save for his future educational expenses. And any savings that we have beyond that, we have invested in an account that is a taxable brokerage account, the purpose of which is for any savings goal that is more than 5 to 10 years out. And we save here so that that money has a little bit more time to grow. And by the time we save up for that goal that is that far away, compound interest can help us reach those goals without us having to save absolutely every dollar of those goals. This can be especially helpful for very large items like a car or a home down payment. Now, that isn't to say that you have to invest when you have big goals or goals that are far out into the future. It's just something that I personally do that I think is prudent for us. When it comes to investments, you need to make sure that you never invest in anything that you don't understand. And if you're needing help with making investments, seeking advice from a licensed professional can be very helpful. As long as you're seeking knowledge and building an understanding of what it is that you're doing with investments before you engage with it, you're probably going to be all right. The last category that I have in my personal budget is discretionary. You could also maybe call this one the luxury category. This is where you put the big items that are luxuries, like vacations, or if you wanted to buy a boat or an RV and it wasn't an essential need, it's a big toy, it's a big event, it's a luxury. Let's use a vacation as an example. You've saved up for a really big vacation. It's your dream vacation. And that money lives under the sinking fund for vacation in your savings account. On the month, when you plan on pulling that money out to pay for your vacation, you would list a negative line item in that savings account on that line item in the budget. This indicates that you're pulling that money out from that sinking fund in order to spend it in another category. And that category would live under discretionary or under luxury. It would say vacation, and you would have an equal-ish amount there to the money that you're pulling out from savings. That negative number in the savings helps keep the budget balanced. And that's basically in a nutshell how the budget works, how the zero-based budget works. There are two more things that I want to cover before we end today's episode. The first is, it's not an uncommon question for when you're working a zero-based budget and you say, okay, everything going into my checking account is going out. Does that mean that my checking account begins and ends with a zero balance? And the answer there is no, but it does begin and end every month with the same value. This value, the amount that you keep in your checking account, is lovingly referred to in my world as the buffer. The buffer is probably going to be equal somewhere between half to 100% of your monthly income. The buffer serves as a way that you don't overdraft if you're waiting for a paycheck to come through later in the month, but you have the rent or the mortgage coming due before all of that money has come back in. The buffer in the checking account, if it's equal to your monthly income, is going to give you permission to spend money, give money, or save money that's in your budget anytime throughout the month, even if your paycheck hasn't hit. This is a great way to break the paycheck to paycheck cycle because you're no longer dependent on when that paycheck comes through. Another way of thinking about it is you're budgeting the money at the start of the month that lives in the checking account, and you know that your income is simply going to refill it. You're basically a month ahead on your money. So the buffer isn't then, in that mindset, money that you have saved, but more or less money that you have ready to spend to live on that next month. The last thing that I want to share with you about the zero-based budget today is that your budget is going to be planned out, but if you don't know how it's going or how it ended, well, how do you know if it worked? You're going to need to update your budget throughout the month and track how you're doing. That way you know how much you have left to spend for given categories, especially food. Food is one that is always difficult to stay on track with. And at the end of the month, if you've overspent or underspent, then what do? Well, if you spent more than you budgeted, that money has to come from somewhere. Typically, it's going to peel away at your savings, and you're not going to be able to save as much that month or give as much that month as you had otherwise planned. If you end up having to take away from your savings goals month after month because you're not staying on track with your spending budget, well, that's evidence that your savings goals or your savings rate is suffering because you're spending it. And if you're spending away what you otherwise need to be saving in order to have a healthy savings rate, and you're spending it on once, well, that gives you evidence that you need to do something to change your spending behavior during the month in order to make your savings goals happen. And this budget is the plan that enables you to do that on purpose and also quantify by how much you need to make a change. And if you didn't spend as much as you had in your budget, you have some left over, well, what do you do with that money? You get to decide. You get to decide what savings priority you have that you want to put that money toward, or if there was a splurge that you wanted to engage with that money, well, you get to choose what that's going to be, and you can do it intentionally. In the end, what you have actually made that month for income, minus your actual giving, your actual spending, and your actual saving, still needs to equal zero. So at the end of the month, you reconcile your budget. You reconcile what actually happened and still make it zero-based. That way you're still given every dollar a mission, not only proactively, but you verified that it happened. It keeps you on track, and it keeps you honest with yourself on what it is that you're doing with your money. Running a zero-based budget without reviewing it, without reconciling it, is kind of like driving a car that doesn't have any rearview mirrors and doesn't have a GPS. You don't have anything to tell you where you've been, and you don't have anything to tell you if you've made a wrong turn. And yes, it is important to not only write a different budget for every month, but reconcile it every month. And yes, every month is different. There are holidays that only fall on the calendar once a year, and that month is going to be different because of that. If you're like me, you want to make this perfect cookie cutter budget that you can go copy paste every month. There are parts that you can copy paste in between months, but the budget as a whole is going to be different. There's no such thing as a normal month. Every month is its own different and unique animal that needs to be approached with time and care and planning in its own unique budget. If you're looking for motivation on starting a budget, on starting a zero-based budget, well, that's what we're going to be covering next week. We're going to be talking about the whys, the motivating drivers behind budgeting regularly and turning budgeting into a life-changing habit. Until then, budget bravely and enjoy your hope-filled financial future.